Well, my paper looks into two remarkably unsuccessful editions of Vitruvius's De Architectura, the only ancient treatise on architecture to have come down to us. The first of these, a Teubner edition by Fritz Krohn, was marred by endless, seemingly arbitrary conjectures, and the second, the Loeb by Frank Granger, still in print, suffered from the editor's belief in one single manuscript at the expense of grammatical sense. And in this paper, I shall look into how these extreme opposites came to be and how they relate to each editor's own idealization of Vitruvius and his book. First, a few words on the textual history of the De Architectura. The starting point of the modern critical study of the text of Vitruvius is the Teubner edition by Valentin Rose and Hermann Müller-Strübing from 1867. This edition singled out certain manuscripts from between the 9th and 12th centuries as the most important. Of these, I shall only mention two manuscripts that are of significance to this paper, those designated by the letters H and G. H is the oldest extant manuscript, but also of lesser quality than the much later G, and these were early on identified as independent of each other. While the two first Teubner editions are considered the scientific foundation of the study of the text of Vitruvius, they nevertheless left several questions unanswered regarding the relationship between the manuscripts. Yet very few parts of the text were considered loci desperati at the turn of the 20th century. And the text was generally considered quite sound, but details of the relationship between some of the manuscripts were still unclear. The first edition I'll be talking about is the third Teubner, prepared by Fritz Krohn, a teacher at the Schiller Gymnasium in Münster, and published in 1912 as the fruit of some years of Vitruvian labors. Krohn's publications prior to his edition shows him as a representative of the German penchant for conjectural philology of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and an increasingly extreme one at that. His first published foray into Vitruvian studies is his doctoral dissertation of 1896, an edition of Faventinus, the author of a 3rd century abridgment of Vitruvius. This dissertation is mostly concerned with solving textual problems using a newly discovered manuscript. Having first performed this task, Krohn turns his attention towards conjectures, after briefly stating that anyone who reads the text of Faventinus will immediately realize that it is full of errors. What these errors are, he is often happy to remain silent about. Then in 1912, he published a little book of proposed conjectures to the text of Vitruvius, titled Ad, In und andere Paleographica. The ad and in the title refer to Krohn's removal of several instances of the preposition or prefix ad and the preposition or prefix in throughout the text, believing these to be vestiges of marginal notes. Several cases brought up by Krohn do in fact benefit from such a deletion, while a number of them make perfect sense as they were transmitted, if perhaps a little less classical. The approach of proposing conjectures without necessarily identifying any particular problem with the text, while also leaving aside all questions of stemmatics, puts him squarely in the camp of conjectural philology. And that is what would come to characterize his edition of Vitruvius in 1912, and that on a tremendous scale. Krohn's Teubner of 1912 is a veritable cornucopia of conjectures that have mostly been ignored by later editors. It is hard to estimate the number of proposed emendations strewn throughout the text because the conjectures overlap and incorporate other conjectures in such a way that it is sometimes difficult to say where one ends and the next one begins. But they are certainly in the hundreds. And there are a few pages in the book where the name of the editor does not figure in the critical apparatus. The conjectures are mostly transpositions of varying length, deletions, and additions, usually without an explanation, but they seem to be largely motivated by a desire to make the text easier to read, or perhaps in some sense more logical. The preface of the edition serves as a sort of program. not only by what it says, but also by what it nearly passes by in silence, which is the question of the manuscripts. These are described rather cursorily with reference to the work of the previous Teubner editions. Instead, the preface focuses on minutiae of the text of the archetype, as he sees it, and the degree to which it is wrong. A large part of the preface is concerned with demonstrating that a considerable section of Book 5 of Vitruvius, which is Vitruvius's description of a basilica that he constructed at Fano, is an interpolation. The argument of Krohn rests on words synonymous with, but different from, those used by Vitruvius elsewhere, and Krohn derides the basilica description as incompetent and unworthy of the author. Rideret Vitruvius, he writes, Vitruvius would laugh had he ever seen this interpolation. Moreover, the wooden beams of the basilica are described as being made from a type of wood, which Vitruvius in Book 2 states is impervious to rot and fire. And Krohn ridicules this detail, that is its employment in the basilica, and says that had this passage about the basilica been genuine, the building would still be standing. Rideret inquam Vitruvius, he repeats. Vitruvius would laugh, I say. Finally, Krohn remarks that there are a few more conjectures he came up with after the text went to the press, and so he puts them in the preface as well. The immediate reception of Krohn's Teubner was mixed. Some positive reviews viewed it as a successful next step towards recovering Vitruvius's original text. A certain J.F. Dobson, writing for the Classical Review, praised the advances made by Krohn, whom Dobson describes as a conservative editor, and regards the deletion of the section of Vitruvius's Basilica as conclusively proven. The textual scholar Degering, on the other hand, wrote a rather more harsh review for the Berliner Philologische Wochenschrift, criticizing Krohn for not furthering the study of Vitruvius's manuscript tradition. He also laments what he calls the conjectural dilettantism of the editor, and says that this was only to be expected from Krohn after the publication of his book Ad in und andere Paleographica the year before. The controversial character of Krohn's text appears to have been one of the causes for the even stranger Loeb edition of Vitruvius, which was soon to be prepared. The task of translating Vitruvius for the Loeb Classical Library was given to Frank Granger of the University of Nottingham, and formerly an architect, who opted to establish a new text of his own instead of following the usual practice of Loeb translators, namely to use the latest critical edition as a starting point. The full title, Vitruvius on Architecture, edited from the Harleian manuscript 2767 and translated into English by Frank Granger, bears witness to his approach to make use of a single codex optimus, a method more commonly associated with medieval philology at the time. Granger had proposed prior to the publication of the Loeb, in an article in Oxford's Journal of Theological Studies, that one manuscript, H, was the parent of all other Vitruvian manuscripts. His argument in a nutshell may be outlined as follows. H is less classical in its spelling and grammar than the others. Therefore, Granger surmises, the other manuscripts have been corrected after the Carolingian Renaissance so that they may conform with grammatical reforms. G, the manuscript G, generally considered the most valuable of the other manuscripts, being later but more accurately written, is therefore the enemy in Granger's system with all of its devious, seemingly correct readings. Granger also believed that H was produced at Jarrow in England, together with the biblical Codex Amiatinus, and that these two manuscripts brought Christianity and architectural theory to Germany. Moreover, Granger posited that the language of H is characterized by what he rather nebulously terms the vernacular, a living Latin more authentic than the standardized Latin of the Roman upper classes. The language of Vitruvius is technical, typical of architectural specifications, and therefore sometimes highly elliptical or obscure. And precisely the fact that H is more elliptical and obscure than G proves its higher value. Granger also sees some sort of kinship between the language of Vitruvius, as preserved in H, and the language of the Vetus Latina, the earlier Latin translations of the Bible. In the Loeb Vitruvius, published in 2 volumes in 1932 and 34, Granger expands on these ideas in ever more baffling ways. The De Architectura of Vitruvius and the Latin New Testament share certain spiritual affinities, he says, in their language, their, as he believes, provincial origins, and the fact that they are written by and dominated by the class of artisans and merchants, as opposed to the Ciceronian Latin of the empire's aristocracy. The resulting text, the Latin text, is in many ways the opposite of that of Krohn. Throughout, Granger does his best to follow the text of his codex optimus, H, with a few standardizations of unorthodox spellings in the first volume, a decision he came to regret and reverse in the second volume. Occasionally, he allows conjectures or even readings from G, but the general principle of lectio difficilior potior is followed, in some cases to the point of producing nonsense, a fact reflected in the facing translation, which sometimes is at odds with the Latin text in order to be legible English. I shall mention one example typical of the edition. I think I might put this in the chat just so that there's no confusion here. At an early point in Book 2, where Vitruvius wishes to defend the thematic sequence of his 10 books, he writes, "But if anybody raises objections about the placement of this second book in the sequence, because he thinks that it should have come first, I shall give my reasons as follows, so that he may not think I have heard. The latter part, I shall give my reason as follows, so that he may not think I have erred. Ne putet me eravisse, sic reddam rationem," is rendered by H with a single D in the verb reddam. And so Granger sees no reason to correct this and writes si credam rationem, which with the translation, "let him not think that I have erred if I believe in reason." To this he adds a footnote which reads, "H retains Vitruvius's creed. Credo with the accusative is found in some early creeds." This puzzling remark about creeds is somewhat expanded upon in the introduction to the first volume, where Granger writes, "The affinity of the Western Church with Vitruvius is deeply rooted, indeed, if we follow the oldest reading. Let no one think I have erred if I believe in the Logos." The Logos presumably being the Logos of the Gospel of John, an idea which is difficult to make sense of considering that Vitruvius predates Christianity with about half a century. The totality of Granger's argument of the excellence of age, its affinity with the Western Church, the vernacular of the Roman provinces, etc., is hard to grasp. Frank Granger's Loeb Vitruvius was met with almost exclusively negative reviews. The main objections of the reviews were as follows. What they perceived to be Granger's poor archaeological knowledge and his failure to provide an extensive and updated bibliography on this subject. The point about the bibliography seems to have been exacerbated by Granger's brief footnote accompanying the bibliography, which reads, "Much that has been written on Vitruvius may safely be neglected," a remark which several of the reviews reproduce word for word with some irony. The decision to make a new text is also criticized by reviews in light of the previous Teubners. The notion that G is a mere recension of H and that H was produced at Jarrow is refuted in the strongest terms by, among others, Charles Beeson, writing for the journal Classical Philology. Beeson calls Granger's reliance on H blind devotion and states that Professor Granger has practically adopted the rule that whatever is abnormal in H is good and whatever is normal in G is bad. Some of the usages attributed to Vitruvius would almost mark him as illiterate. D.S. Robertson, reviewing the first volume for the Classical Review, states that Granger's belief in H's unique authority is accompanied by a superstitious reverence for its readings, good or bad. Several reviewers point out that bits of text missing in H but present in G are obvious cases of haplography and cannot possibly be the result of some revision with a view to grammatical conformity. The decision to read si credam rationem for sic reddam rationem is singled out by several reviewers as emblematic of Granger's fundamental error. Interestingly, no review I have found responds much to the Christianizing angle of Granger's edition. Now, Granger wasted no time in responding to his critics. Both Beeson and Robertson, just cited, received rebuttals from Granger in the same journals, as did others. In response to his supposed lacking archaeological knowledge, Granger advises his critics to look outside of Europe and to North Africa, where they will find plenty of traces of Vitruvius's influence, as well as the home of his vernacular Latin. As for the decision to make a new text, Granger points to his problems with Krohn's text, which he considered to be a hopeless starting point for his edition. Having read through the five first books in Krohn's edition, he could only accept 8 of more than 150 emendations. As for the relationship between age and G, and the provenience of age, Granger does not respond much to these problems, at least not in the terms of the objections raised by his critics. Instead, his responses tend to relate his personal history with Vitruvius, which is apparently of some personal importance, and his view that Vitruvius's work represents the vernacular. What exactly he means by vernacular is difficult to discern, but it is clearly a more living form of Latin, different from the linguistic stagnations that he thinks existed in urban writers. Incidentally, he also brings up his own experience with speaking Latin as a living language. A term he frequently returns to is Ciceronian. Ciceronians are evidently the enemy. G was corrected to fit Ciceronian grammar. Krohn is a Ciceronian, as are Granger's critics. And especially, Granger emphasizes his own experience as an architect. In fact, it takes a craftsman to understand Vitruvius. Ciceronians can never hope to do so, as they do not understand the Latin of the proletariat. In his response to Robertson's review, he writes, Mr. Krohn is a Ciceronian and is thereby at a disadvantage in following his author-craftsman's thought. Now, one review that does not get a response is that which was written by Fritz Krohn himself, who delivered a quite negative review of Granger's first volume in the Philologische Wochenschrift on Christmas Eve of 1932. Krohn's assessment of Granger's edition is relatively brief. He refutes the idea of age being the parent of the other manuscripts, and he refuses to believe that age was written at Jarrow. And like several others, he mocks the statement that much that has been written on Vitruvius may safely be neglected. It is only after the review proper that Krohn's response takes on a character of its own. Having dismissed the new Loeb edition, Krohn proceeds to spend a full 6 pages on proposing a staggering 30 new conjectures on the text, and estimates that there remain more than 1,000 conjectures to be cranked out before the text will be satisfactory. He concludes the review with a sort of programmatic statement. A new edition of Vitruvius must have as its starting point that the architect recognized by Caesar and honored by Augustus must, despite all the manuscripts, have been in possession of a head capable of thinking clearly. This statement exhibits, in a way, an attitude almost exactly similar to that of his colleague Granger, yet with completely different implications. They both agree that Vitruvius was a great architect and a great mind, and they both seek to regain Vitruvius's real character by going against the manuscript evidence. So, to conclude, it should come as no surprise that both of the editions I've discussed are considered to be fundamentally misguided, and that subsequent textual scholars have not followed their leads. Yet the editions of Vitruvius by Krohn and Granger do perhaps reflect, more than any other modern editions, the uniqueness of Vitruvius in the body of transmitted ancient literature. While Vitruvius, the sole ancient authority on architecture, was highly respected in the early modern period, he came to be heavily criticized in the 19th and 20th centuries, as the new science of archaeology proved Vitruvius to be wrong or incomplete in some regards, and often just too difficult to comprehend. There exists, to my knowledge, no comprehensive study of the reception of Vitruvius in modern times, but Vitruvian scholars of later years often remark on how much disparagement the Roman architect has had to endure during the course of the last 150 years or so. I shall avoid making sweeping statements, but I believe that this is in no small part due to the solitary status of Vitruvius as an authority on ancient architecture. And as classical architecture is a revered part of Western cultural heritage, it may cause frustration whenever Vitruvius does not give the outlook or answers that modern readers desire. The solution to this alienation from ancient ideas of architecture has sometimes been to declare him as incompetent and brush him aside. Other times, the solution is to salvage Vitruvius by, paradoxically, rejecting the evidence itself, by disregarding everything that doesn't fit. And this is what Krohn and Granger seem to me to have taken to its textual extremes. Both editors have conceived of an image of Vitruvius which is too idealized and perfect for them to have any regard for such petty details as the transmitted text. Thank you.